Chapter 11, Critique. Surely there are no hard and fast rules. It all depends on how it's done. Pauline Kael, film critic. Learning objectives. Name the 3 categories of people who critique movies, and list the 3 areas of inquiry on which critics and theorists focus their attention. List the 5 ideological characteristics and 6 stylistic features of the neorealist style of film. Describe how formalist film theories approach space, time, and reality in film. Explain what makes an auteur, and describe how auteur theory revolutionized film criticism. Identify what it means to be an eclectic critic, and describe the benefits and faults of an eclectic approach to film criticism. Summarize the techniques of structuralism and semiology, and explain their relation to various scientific disciplines. Define historiography and outline the 4 types of film history. This chapter devotes itself to how film critics and theorists have responded to movies, how they evaluate them, and how they place them in a wider intellectual context. People who critique movies fall into 3 general classes. 1. Reviewers are generally journalists who describe the contents and general tone of a movie, with only incidental emphasis on aesthetic evaluation. Often such writers point out whether a given film is suitable for children or not. 2. Critics are also journalists for the most part, but their emphasis is more on evaluation than on mere content description. Nationally known film critics can have considerable influence on the commercial success or failure of a given movie. 3. Theorists are usually professional academics, often the authors of books on how movies can be studied on a more philosophical level. Most theorists are concerned with the wider context of the medium, its social and political implications. Theorists have also explored the essential nature of cinema, what differentiates it from other art forms, what its basic properties are. For the most part, film theory has been dominated by Europeans, especially the French and British. The tradition of criticism in the United States has been less theoretical and more pragmatic in its thrust. In recent times, however, American movie critics have shown a greater interest in the theoretical implications of the medium, though the bias in favor of practical criticism remains strong. A theory is an intellectual grid, a set of aesthetic generalizations, not eternal verities. Some theories are more useful than others in understanding specific movies. No single theory can explain them all. For this reason, recent developments in the field have stressed an eclectic approach, synthesizing a variety of strategies. Traditionally, critics and theorists have focused their attention on 3 areas of inquiry: 1. The work of art, 2. The artist, and 3. The audience. Those who have stressed the work of art have explored the inner dynamics of movies, how they communicate, the language systems they use. Film theorists can be divided into realists and formalists, just as filmmakers tend to favor one style or the other. The most important artist-oriented approach is the auteur theory, the belief that a movie is best understood by focusing on its artistic creator, presumably the director. Structuralism and semiology were the dominant theories after 1970, and both tend to emphasize a synthetic approach, combining such concerns as genre, authorship, style, iconography, social context, and ideology. In the area of historiography, the theoretical assumptions underlying film history, recent trends have also emphasized an integrated approach. Theories of realism. Most theories of realism emphasize the documentary aspects of film art. Movies are evaluated primarily in terms of how accurately they reflect external reality. The camera is regarded as essentially a recording mechanism rather than an expressive medium in its own right. The subject matter is paramount in the cinema of realism. Technique is discreetly transparent handmaiden, as we have seen in the case of André Bazin, Chapter 4. Most theories of realism have a moral and ethical bias and are often rooted in the values of Islamic, Christian, and Marxist humanism. Realist theorists like Cesare Zavattini and Siegfried Krauer believed that cinema is essentially an extension of photography and shares with it a pronounced affinity for recording the visible world around us. 11-8. Unlike other art forms, photography and cinema tend to leave the raw materials of reality more or less intact. There is a minimum of interference and manipulation on the artist's part, for film is not an art of invention so much as an art of being there. Roberto Rossellini's Open City, 11-2B, inaugurated the Italian neorealist movement, one of the triumphs of the cinema of realism. The movie deals with the collaboration of Catholics and communists in fighting the Nazi occupation of Rome shortly before the American army liberated the city. Technically, the film is rather crude. Good quality film stock was impossible to obtain, so Rossellini had to use inferior newsreel stock. Nevertheless, the technical flaws and the resultant grainy images convey a sense of journalistic immediacy and authenticity. Many neorealists began their careers as journalists, and Rossellini himself began as a documentarist. Virtually all the movie was shot at actual locations, and there are many exterior shots in which no additional lights were used. With the exception of the principal players, the actors were non-professionals. The structure of the movie is episodic, a series of vignettes showing the reactions of Roman citizens to the German occupation. Open City is saturated with a sense of unrelenting honesty. This is the way things are, Rossellini is said to have declared after the film premiered. The statement became the motto of the neorealist movement. The film provided a rallying point for an entire generation of Italian filmmakers whose creative talents had been stifled by the repressive fascist regime of the pre-war era. Within the next few years, there followed an astonishing series of movies that catapulted the Italians into the front ranks of the international cinema. The major filmmakers of the movement were Rossellini, Luchino Visconti, and Vittorio De Sica and his frequent scriptwriter Cesare Zavattini. There are considerable differences between these men, and even between their early and later works. Furthermore, neorealism implied a style as well as an ideology. Rossellini emphasized the ethical dimension. For me, neorealism is above all a moral position from which to look at the world. It then became an aesthetic position, but at the beginning it was moral. De Sica, Zavattini, and Visconti also stressed morality as the touchstone of neorealism. The main ideological characteristics of the movement can be summarized as follows. 1. A new democratic spirit, with emphasis on the value of ordinary people such as laborers, peasants, and factory workers. 2. A compassionate point of view and a refusal to make facile moral judgments. 3. A preoccupation with Italy's fascist past and its aftermath of wartime devastation, poverty, unemployment, prostitution, and the black market. 4. A blending of Christian and Marxist humanism. And 5. An emphasis on emotions rather than abstract ideas. The stylistic features of neorealism include 1. An avoidance of neatly plotted stories in favor of loose, episodic structures that evolve organically from the situations of the characters. 2. A documentary visual style. 3. The use of actual locations, usually exteriors, rather than studio sets. 4. The use of non-professional actors, sometimes even for principal roles. 5. An avoidance of literary dialogue in favor of conversational speech, including dialects. And 6. An avoidance of artifice in the editing, camera work, and lighting in favor of a simple, styleless style. Realists have shown a persistent hostility toward plot and neatly structured stories. For example, Cesare Zavattini defined the ordinary and the everyday as the main business of the cinema. Spectacular events and extraordinary characters should be avoided at all costs, he believed. He claimed that his ideal movie would consist of 90 consecutive minutes from a person's actual life. There should be no barriers between reality and the spectator, no directorial virtuosity to deform the integrity of life as it is. The artistry should be invisible, the materials found rather than shaped or manipulated. Suspicious of conventional plot structures, Zavattini dismissed them as dead formulas. He insisted on the dramatic superiority of life as it is experienced by ordinary people. Filmmakers should be concerned with the excavation of reality. Instead of plots, they should emphasize facts and all their echoes and reverberations. According to Zavattini, filmmaking is not a matter of inventing fables that are superimposed over the factual materials of life, but of searching unrelentingly to uncover the dramatic implications of these facts. The purpose of the cinema is to explore the dailiness of events, to reveal certain details that have always been there but had never been noticed. In his book Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality, the German trained theater Siegfried Krakauer also attacked plot as a natural enemy of realism. According to Krakauer, the cinema is characterized by a number of natural affinities. First of all, it tends to favor unstaged reality. That is, the most appropriate subject matter gives the illusion of having been found rather than arranged. Second, film tends to stress the random, the fortuitous. Krakauer was fond of the phrase, nature caught in the act, meaning that film is best suited to recording events and objects that might be overlooked in life. The realistic cinema is a cinema of found moments and poignant revelations of humanity. A third affinity that Krakauer noted was indeterminacy. The best movies suggest endlessness. They imply a slice of life, a fragment of a larger reality rather than a self-contained whole. By refusing to tie up all the loose ends at the conclusion of the movie, the filmmaker can suggest a limitlessness of reality. Krakauer was hostile toward movies that demonstrated a formative tendency. He regarded historical films and fantasies as tending to move away from the basic concerns of the medium. He also dismissed most literary and dramatic adaptations because he believes that literature is ultimately concerned with interior realities, what people are thinking and feeling, whereas movies explore surfaces, exterior reality. He regarded all stylistic self-consciousness as uncinematic because instead of emphasizing the subject matter, the filmmaker calls attention to how it is presented. Theories of film realism are not very helpful in understanding the complexities of formless movies, the works of a Sergei Eisenstein or a Steven Spielberg. On the other hand, they do help to explain the raw emotional power of such masterpieces of realism as Bicycle Thieves, which was directed by Vittorio De Sica and scripted primarily by Zavattini, 6338. Bicycle Thieves was acted entirely by non-professionals and consists of simple events in the life of a laborer, played by Lamberto Maggiorani, who was an actual factory worker. In 1948, when the film was released, nearly a quarter of the workforce in Italy was unemployed. At the opening of the movie, we are introduced to the protagonist, a family man with a wife and 2 children to support. He has been out of work for 2 years. Finally, a billboard posting job opens up, but to accept it, he must have a bicycle. To get his bike out of hock, he and his wife pawn their sheets on bedding. On his first day on the job, the bicycle is stolen. The rest of the movie deals with his attempts to recover the bike. The man's search grows increasingly more frantic as he crisscrosses the city with his idolizing son, Bruno. After a series of false leads, the two finally track down one of the thieves, but the protagonist is outwitted by him and humiliated in front of his boy. Realizing that he will lose his livelihood without a bike, the desperate man, after sending his son away, sneaks off and attempts to steal one himself. But the boy observes from a distance as his father pedals frantically to escape a pursuing mob. He is caught and again humiliated in front of a crowd, which includes his incredulous son. With the bitterness of betrayed innocence, the youngster suddenly realizes that his dad is not the heroic figure he had formerly thought, but an ordinary man who in desperation yielded to a degrading temptation. Like most neorealist films, Bicycle Thieves doesn't offer a slick solution. There are no miraculous interventions in the final reel. The concluding scene shows the boy walking alongside his father in an anonymous crowd, both of them choking with shame and weeping silently. Almost imperceptibly, the boy's hand gropes for his father's as they walk homeward, their only comfort a mutual compassion. Formalist film theorists believe that the art of cinema is possible precisely because a movie is unlike everyday reality. The filmmaker exploits the limitations of the medium. its two-dimensionality, its confining frame, its fragmented time-space continuum, to produce a world that resembles the real world only in a superficial sense. The real world is merely a repository of raw material that needs to be shaped and heightened to be effective as art. Film art doesn't consist of a reproduction of reality, but a translation of observed characteristics into the forms of the medium. Rudolf Arnheim, a Gestalt psychologist, put forth an important theory of cinematic formalism in his book Film as Art, which was originally published in German in 1933. Arnheim's book is primarily concerned with the perception of experience. His theory is based on the different modes of perception of the camera on the one hand and the human eye on the other. Anticipating some of the theories of the communications specialist Marshall McLuhan, Arnheim insisted that the camera's image of a bowl of fruit, for instance, is fundamentally different from our perception of the fruit bowl in actual life. Or, in McLuhan's terms, the information we receive in each instance is determined by the form of its content. Formless theorists celebrate these differences, believing that what makes photography fall short of perfect reproduction is also what makes cinema an art, not just a species of xerography. Formalists have pointed out many instances where divergences exist between the camera's image of reality and what the human eye sees. For example, film directors must choose from which viewpoint to photograph a scene. They don't necessarily choose the clearest view, for often this does not emphasize the major characteristics of the scene, its expressive essence. In life, we perceive objects in depth and can penetrate the space that surrounds most things. In movies, space is an illusion, for the screen has only two dimensions, permitting the director to manipulate objects and perspectives in the mise-en-scene. For example, important objects can be placed where they are most likely to be noticed first. Unimportant objects can be relegated to inferior positions, at the edges or rear of the image. In real life, space and time are experienced as continuous. Through editing, filmmakers can chop up space and time and rearrange them in a more meaningful manner. Like other artists, the film director selects certain expressive details from the chaotic plenitude of physical reality. By juxtaposing these space and time fragments, the filmmaker creates a continuity that doesn't exist in raw nature. This, of course, was the basic position of the Soviet montage theorists. Chapter 4. Formalists are always concerned with patterns, methods of restructuring reality into aesthetically appealing designs. Patterns can be expressed visually, through the photography and mise-en-scene, or orally, in stylized dialogue, symbolic sound effects, and musical motifs. Camera movements are often kinetic patterns superimposed on the visual materials, commenting on them in some heightened manner. The problems with most formalist theories are the same as with realist theories. There are too many exceptions. They are certainly useful in an appreciation of Hitchcock's works, for example, or Tim Burton's. But how helpful are these theories in explaining the films of Spike Lee or De Sica? We respond to their movies because of their similarities with physical reality, not their divergences from it. Ultimately, of course, these are matters of emphasis, for films are too pluralistic to be pigeonholed into one tidy theory. The auteur theory in the mid-1950s, the French journal Cahiers du Cinéma revolutionized film criticism with its concept of la politique des auteurs. This committed policy of authors was put forth by the pugnacious young critic François Truffaut. The auteur theory became the focal point of a critical controversy that eventually spread to England and America. Before long, the theory became a militant rallying cry, particularly among younger critics, dominating such lively journals as Movie in Britain, Film Culture in America, and both French and English language editions of Cahiers du Cinéma. Although a number of writers rejected the theory as simplistic, auteurism dominated film criticism throughout the 1960s, and is still a prominent approach among critics. Actually, the main lines of the theory aren't particularly outrageous, at least not in retrospect. Truffaut, Goddard, and their critical colleagues proposed that the greatest movies are dominated by the personal vision of the director. A filmmaker's signature can be perceived through an examination of his or her total output, which is characterized by a unity of theme and style. The writer's contribution is less important than the director's because subject matter is artistically neutral. It can be treated with brilliance or bare competence. Movies ought to be judged on the basis of how, not what. Like other formalists, the auteur critics claimed that what makes a good film is not the subject matter as such, but its stylistic treatment. The director dominates the treatment, provided he or she is a strong director and author. Drawing primarily from the cinematic traditions of the United States, the Cahers critics also developed a sophisticated theory of film genre. In fact, Andre Bazin, the editor of the journal, believed that the genius of the American cinema was its repository of ready-made forms: westerns, thrillers, musicals, action films, comedies, and so on. The tradition of genres is the base of operations for creative freedom, Bazin pointed out. Genre is an enriching, not a constricting, tradition. The authors argued that the best movies are dialectical, in which the conventions of a genre are held in aesthetic tension with the personality of the artist. The American authors that these critics praised had worked within the studio system, which had broken the artistic ambitions of many lesser filmmakers. What the authors especially admired was how gifted directors could circumvent studio interference and even hackneyed scripts through their technical expertise. The subject matter of Hitchcock's thrillers or Ford's westerns was not significantly different from others working in these genres. Yet both authors managed to create great films, precisely because the real content was conveyed through the mise-en-scene, the editing, and all the other formal devices at the director's disposal. The sheer breadth of their knowledge of film history permitted these critics to re-evaluate the major works of a wide variety of directors. In many instances, they completely reversed previous critical judgments. Before long, personality cults developed around the most popular directors. On the whole, these were filmmakers who had been virtually ignored by the critical establishment of the previous generation: Hitchcock, Ford, Hawks, Lang, and many others. The auteur critics were often dogmatic in their dislikes as well as their likes. Bazin expressed alarm at their negativism. To praise a bad movie, he felt, was unfortunate, but to condemn a good one was a serious failing. He especially disliked their tendency to hero worship, which led to superficial a priori judgments. Movies by cult directors were indiscriminately praised, whereas those by directors out of fashion were automatically condemned. Authors were fond of ranking directors, and their listings could be bizarre. Perfectly routine commercial directors like Nicholas Ray were elevated above such important masters as John Huston and Billy Wilder. The principal spokesman for the auteur theory in the United States was Andrew Sarris, the influential critic of The Village Voice. More knowledgeable about the complexities of the star and studio system than his French counterparts, Sarris nonetheless defended their basic argument, especially the principle of tension between an artist's personal vision and the genre assignments that these directors were given by their Hollywood bosses. Quite correctly, these critics insisted that total artistic freedom isn't always a virtue. After all, Michelangelo, Dickens, and Shakespeare, among others, accepted commissioned subjects. Though this principle of dialectic tension is a sound one, in the other arts as well as cinema, some authors carried it to ridiculous extremes. In the first place, there is the problem of degree. It's doubtful that even a genius like Bergman or Kubrick could do much with the script and stars of Abbott and Costello meet the Mummy. In other words, a director's got to have a fighting chance with the material. When the subject matter sinks beneath a certain potential, the result is not tension but artistic annihilation. The most gifted American directors of the studio era were producer-directors who worked independently within the major studios. These tended to be the same artists the auteur critics admired most. But the lion's share of American fiction movies produced during this era were studio films. That is, The director functioned as a member of a team and usually had little to say about the scripting, casting, or editing. Many of these directors were skillful technicians, but they were essentially craftsmen rather than artists. Michael Curtiz is a good example. For most of his career, he was a contract director at Warner Brothers. Known for his speed and efficiency, Curtiz directed dozens of movies in a variety of styles and genres. He often took on several projects at the same time. Curtiz had no personal vision in the sense that the auteur theory defines it. He was just getting a job done. He often did it very well. Even so, movies like Yankee Doodle Dandy, Casablanca, and Mildred Pierce 11138 can be discussed more profitably as Warner Brothers movies rather than Michael Curtiz movies. The same principle applies to most of the other Hollywood studios. In our day, it applies to films that are dominated by producers and financiers rather than artists. Other films have been dominated by stars. Few people would think of referring to a Mae West movie as anything else, and the same holds true for the W.C. Fields comedies and the works of Laurel and Hardy. The ultimate in the star as auteur is the so-called star vehicle, a film specifically tailored to showcase the talents of a performer. 1115. The auteur theory suffers from a number of other weaknesses. There are some excellent films that have been made by directors who are otherwise mediocre. For example, Joseph H. Lewis's Gone Crazy is a superb movie, but it's atypical of his output. Conversely, great directors sometimes produce bombs. The works of such major filmmakers as Ford, Goddard, Renoir, and Buñuel are radically inconsistent in terms of quality, and some of their movies are outright awful. The auteur theory emphasizes history and the director's total output, which tends to favor older directors at the expense of newcomers. Some artists have explored a variety of themes in many different styles and genres. David Lean, Sidney Lumet, and Ang Lee are good examples. There are also some great filmmakers who are crude directorial technicians. For example, Chaplin and Herzog in no way approach the stylistic fluency of Michael Curtiz, or a dozen other contract directors of his era. Yet there are very few artists who have created such distinctively personal movies as Chaplin and Herzog. Despite its shortcomings and excesses, the auteur theory had a liberating effect on film criticism, establishing the director as the key figure at least in the art of cinema, if not always the industry. To this day, the concept of directorial dominance remains firmly established, at least with films of high artistic merit. 1114. Eclectic and synthesizing approaches. Eclecticism is the favored approach of many film critics in the United States, such as the former critic of The New Yorker, Pauline Kael. She once wrote, "I believe that we respond most and best to work in any art form, and to other experience as well, if we are pluralistic, flexible, relative in our judgments, if we are eclectic." Such critics place a movie in whatever context seems most appropriate, drawing from diverse sources, systems, and styles. Actually, almost all critics are eclectic to some degree. For example, although Andrew Sarris was identified with the auteur theory, he was equally at home approaching a movie in terms of its star, its period, its national origin, or its ideological context. Eclecticism is sometimes called the tradition of sensibility because a high value is placed on the aesthetic discriminations of a person of taste and discernment. Such critics are often urbane, well-educated, and conversant in the other arts. The cultural cross-references in the writings of such critics as Roger Ebert, David Denby, and Frank Rich range over a wide spectrum, including literature, drama, politics, and the visual arts. They frequently allude to the ideas of such seminal thinkers as Freud, Marx, Darwin, and Jung. Sometimes critics combine an ideological perspective, such as feminism, with practical criticism, sociology, and history, as in the criticism of Molly Haskell and B. Ruby Rich. The best eclectic critics are gifted writers, including such distinguished prose stylists as James A.G., Pauline Kael, and Roger Ebert, whose film criticism has won a Pulitzer Prize. Polished writing is valued as writing, in addition to the ideas it conveys. Eclectic critics reject the notion that a single theory can explain all movies. They regard this as a cookie-cutter approach to criticism. Most of them insist that an individual's reaction to a film is deeply personal. For this reason, the best a critic can do is explain his or her personal responses as forcefully as possible. But it's just an opinion, however well-founded or gracefully argued. The best criticism of this type is informative even if we don't agree with its conclusions. Because personal taste is the main determinant of value in eclectic criticism, these commentators often admit to their blind spots, and all critics have blind spots. Everyone has had the experience of being left totally cold by a movie that's widely hailed as a masterpiece. We can't help the way we feel, however much our feelings go against popular sentiment. Eclectic critics usually begin with their feelings about a movie, then work outward, trying to objectify these instincts with concrete arguments. To guard against personal eccentricity, they implicitly place a film within the context of a canon, a tradition of masterpieces. That is, those works that have stood the test of time and are still considered milestones in the evolution of the cinema. This great tradition is constantly under re-evaluation. It's a loose critical consensus rather than an ironclad body of privileged works. Eclecticism has been faulted on a number of counts. There's an old Latin saying, de gustibus non disputandum. There's no disputing taste. Some people might prefer one film over another, but often the choice is a matter of taste, not absolute value. If we're in the mood for a comedy, even a somber masterpiece like The Godfather is not going to satisfy us. Taste is highly personal, subject to a variety of factors that have nothing to do with external considerations of excellence. Because of its extreme subjectivity, this approach has been criticized as mere impressionism by more rigorously systematic critics. They insist that aesthetic evaluations ought to be governed by a body of theoretical principles rather than a critic's unique sensibility, however refined. Eclectic critics often disagree because each of them is reacting to a movie according to his or her own taste rather than a larger theoretical framework, with its built-in system of checks and balances. For all their vaunted expertise and cultural prestige, eclectic critics have track records that don't always bear close scrutiny. For example, when Fellini's 8-1, /2 was released in 1963, many critics in America and Europe dismissed the movie as self-indulgent, formless, and even incoherent. Yet in a 1972 survey of international critics, 8-1, /2 ranked among the 10 greatest films of all time. In 2012, it was still in the top 10. Conversely, even good critics have pronounced a film an instant masterpiece, only to regret their impetuosity in the cool distance of time, after the movie has been long forgotten. Eclectic critics tend to be stoical about these matters, accepting them as perils of the trade. Perhaps Pauline Kael expressed their attitude best. The role of the critic is to help people see what is in the work, what is in it that shouldn't be, what is not in it that could be. He is a good critic if he helps people understand more about the work than they could see for themselves. He is a great critic if by his understanding and feeling for the work, by his passion, he can excite people so that they want to experience more of the art that is there, waiting to be seized. He is not necessarily a bad critic if he makes errors in judgment. Infallible taste is inconceivable. What could it be measured against? He is a bad critic if he does not awaken the curiosity, enlarge the interest and understanding of his audience. The art of the critic is to transmit his knowledge of and enthusiasm for art to others. Quoted from I Lost It at the Movies, New York, Bantam, 1966. Structuralism and semiology. Eclectic critics celebrate the subjective, individual element in film criticism. Others have lamented it. In the early 1970s, two interrelated cinematic theories developed: partly in response to the inadequacies of the criticism of personal sensibility. Structuralism and semiology were attempts to introduce a new scientific rigor to film criticism, to allow for more systematic and detailed analyses of movies. Borrowing their methodology from such diverse disciplines as linguistics, anthropology, psychology, and philosophy, these two theories first concentrated on the development of a more precise analytical terminology. Structuralism and semiology have also focused intently on the American cinema as the principal area of inquiry, for a number of reasons. In the first place, these theories have been dominated by the British and French, traditionally the most enthusiastic foreign admirers of the cinema of the United States. American movies also provided these critics with a stylistic norm, the classical paradigm. Marxists among this group have explored the implications of the capitalistic mode of production of American films. Cultural commentators have concentrated on characteristically American myths and genres. Semiology, or semiotics, as it's also called, is a study of how movies signify. The manner in which information is signified is indissolubly linked with what's being signified. The French theater's Christian Metz was at the forefront of developing semiotics as a technique of film analysis. Using many of the concepts and much of the terminology of structural linguistics, Metz and others developed a theory of cinematic communication founded on the concept of signs or codes. The language of cinema, like all types of discourse, verbal and nonverbal, is primarily symbolic. It consists of a complex network of signs we instinctively decipher while experiencing a movie. 1118. Chapter 11 Critique page 477. In most discussions of film, the shot was generally accepted as the basic unit of construction. Semiotic theorists rejected this unit as too vague and inclusive. They insisted on a more precise concept. Accordingly, they suggested that the sign be adopted as the minimal unit of signification. A single shot from a movie generally contains dozens of signs, forming an intricate hierarchy of counterpoised meanings. In a sense, this book, and especially the earlier chapters, can be viewed as a classification of signs. For example, each of these chapters is concerned with a kind of master code, which can be broken down into code subdivisions, which themselves can be reduced to even more minimal signs. Thus, Chapter 1 might be called a photography master code. This master could be broken down into subdivisions, shots, angles, lighting keys, colors, lenses, filters, optical effects, and so on. Each of these, in turn, could be subdivided again. The shots, for example, could be broken down to extreme long, medium, close-up, extreme close-up, deep focus. This same principle could be applied to other master codes, spatial codes, mise-en-scene, kinetic codes, movement, and so on. Codes of language would be as complex as the entire discipline of linguistics. Acting codes would involve a precise breakdown of the various techniques of signification used by players. Semiotic techniques can be valuable in aiding film critics and scholars to analyze movies with more precision. But the theory suffers some defects. For one thing, these are descriptive classifications only, not evaluative. In other words, semiotics will permit a critic to discern a sign, but it's still up to the critic to evaluate how effective any given sign is within an artistic context. Formless movies seem to lend themselves to easier classification than realistic movies. For example, it's much simpler to describe the complex mise-en-scene of Troy than to explicate the meanings of Chaplin's expression in The Bank, 1119 A and B. These signs aren't really comparable. They exist on incompatible levels, like different language systems of a computer. Because formless signs are easier to quantify, some critics tend to value films with a greater number of signs, or at least a greater number of classifiable signs, as more complex than, and hence aesthetically superior to, a film with a lower density of signs. Another serious problem with this theory is its awful jargon, which sometimes verges on self-parody. All specialized disciplines, including cinema, have a certain number of necessary technical terms, but semiotics often chokes on its own scientific wordiness. Even within the field, one commentator pointed out that referring to a perfectly ordinary phenomenon as signifier or signified, syntem or paradigm doesn't in itself advance social knowledge to any particular degree. As Metz pointed out, semiology is concerned with the systematic classification of types of codes used in the cinema. Structuralism is the study of how various codes function within a single structure, within one movie. Structuralism is strongly eclectic and often combines the techniques of semiotics with other theoretical perspectives, such as auteurism, genre studies, ideology, stylistic analyses, and so on. For example, Colin MacArthur's Underworld USA is a structuralist analysis of gangster and crime films and the style known as film noir. MacArthur uses semiotic classifications in exploring the iconography of the genre films of such artists as Billy Wilder, 117A, and others. Structuralists and semiologists have been fascinated by the concept of a deep structure, an underlying network of symbolic meaning that is related to a movie's surface structure but is also somewhat independent of it. This deep structure can be analyzed from a number of perspectives, including Freudian psychoanalysis, Marxist economics, Jungian concepts of the collective unconscious, and the theory of structural anthropology popularized by the Frenchman Claude Lévi-Strauss. The methods of Lévi-Strauss are based on an examination of regional myths, which he believed express certain underlying structures of thought in codified form. These myths exist in varying forms and usually contain the same or similar binary structures, pairs of opposites. By collapsing the surface narrative structure of myths, their symbolic motifs can be analyzed in a more systematic and meaningful manner. These polarities are usually found in dialectical conflict. Depending on the culture analyzed, they can be agricultural, for example, water versus drought, sexual, male versus female, conceptual, cooked versus raw, generational, youth versus age, and so on. Because these myths are expressed in symbolic codes, often their full meanings are hidden even from their creators. Lévi-Strauss believed that once the full implications of a myth are understood, it's discarded as a cliché. These structural techniques can be used to analyze a national cinema, a genre, or a specific movie. For example, the conflict between traditional and modern values can be seen in virtually all Japanese movies, and in Japanese society in general. 1121. The roots of this conflict extend back to the later 19th century, when Japan transformed itself from a feudal country to a modern technological society patterned after the Western industrial states, especially Britain and the United States. The Japanese are simultaneously repelled and attracted by both sets of polarities. Traditional modern Japanese Western feudal democratic past future society individual hierarchy equality nature technology duty inclination self-sacrifice self-expression consensus diversity age youth authority autonomy conservative liberal fatalism optimism obedience independence form substance security anxiety. A number of structuralists have explored genre films in a similar manner. For example, Jim Kitzes, Peter Wallen, and others have pointed out how Westerns are often vehicles for exploring clashes of value between East and West in American culture. By clustering the thematic motifs around a master antinomy, a controlling or dominant code, a Western can be analyzed according to its deep structure rather than its plot, which is often conventionalized and less meaningful in genre films. Such critics have demonstrated how each cultural polarity symbolizes a complex of positive and negative traits: West-East wilderness civilization individualism community self-interest social welfare freedom restriction anarchy law and order savagery refinement private honor institutional justice paganism Christianity nature culture masculine feminine pragmatism idealism agrarian industrial purity corruption dynamic static future past experience knowledge American European semiotics and structuralism expanded the parameters of film critique considerably. Their pluralistic approach allows for much more flexibility, complexity, and depth in the critical enterprise. But these theories are merely tools of analysis. By themselves, they can tell us nothing of the value of signs and codes within a film. Like every other theory, then, these are only as good as their practitioner. The writer's intelligence, taste, passion, knowledge, and sensitivity are what produce good criticism, not necessarily the theoretical methodology used. Historiography deals with the theory of history, the assumptions, principles, and methodologies of historical study. Film history is a relatively recent area of inquiry. 120 years is not a very lengthy period of study compared to that of the traditional arts. Much of the best work in film historiography has taken place during the past 2 decades. Film historians scoff at the naive notion that there is a film history. Rather, they insist that there are many film histories, and each is defined by the historian's particular interests, biases, and prejudices. Theorists have charted 4 different types of film history, each with its own set of philosophical assumptions, methods, and sources of evidence. 1. Aesthetic film histories, film as art. 2. Technological film histories, motion pictures as inventions and machines. 3. Economic histories, film as industry. And 4. Social histories, movies as a reflection of the audience's values, desires, and fears. Most film historians regard cinema as too sprawling and complex to be covered by any single history. They view the field as a vast, infinite mass of data that needs to be sifted through and organized to be made coherent. Each historian concentrates on a given type of evidence, highlighting its significance while de-emphasizing or ignoring irrelevant data. Critics sometimes refer to this process of selection and emphasis as foregrounding, isolating fragments of evidence for the purpose of closer study. Foregrounding is always an implicit value judgment. Each type of film historian necessarily wrenches these fragments from their ecological context, thus presenting us with a somewhat skewed view of the whole. Each type of historian will also choose to focus on different movies, personalities, and events. Aesthetic film historians concern themselves with a tradition of masterpieces and great filmmakers. Constantly subject to re-evaluation, this tradition encompasses a broad consensus of critics, historians, and scholars. This is an elite form of history, ignoring the vast majority of motion pictures to concentrate on a relative handful of important works of art that have endured the test of time. That is, movies that are still great despite our viewing them in a totally different context. Aesthetic historians value a work primarily for its artistic richness, irrespective of whether the film was commercially successful. Thus, in most aesthetic histories, a hugely popular success like Independence Day receives much less discussion than Citizen Kane, which failed at the box office. Opponents of this type of history have scoffed at its great man assumptions. That is, film history is largely the study of a few gifted individuals, not the dynamic matrix of social, industrial, and technological influences that inevitably affect all filmmakers, gifted or not. The American scholar Raymond Fielding put forth the philosophy of technological historians succinctly: the history of motion pictures, as an art form, as a medium of communication, and as an industry, has been determined principally by technological innovations. Historians of this type are also concerned with great men, such as W. K. L. Dixon, Thomas Edison, George Eastman, and Lee De Forest, inventors and scientists rather than artists or industry moguls. Technological historians are concerned with the implications, artistic, commercial, and ideological, of such innovations as portable cameras, synchronous sound, color, improved film stocks, 3D, stereophonic sound, Steadicams, computer-generated imagery, and so on. 1123. Cinema is the most expensive artistic medium in history, and its development has been largely determined by its financial sponsors. This is the thesis of most economic film histories, such as Benjamin B. Hampton's History of the American Film Industry from its beginnings to 1931, and Thomas H. Ubach's The International Film Industry, Western Europe and America since 1945. In most European countries, the cinema in its early stages of development fell into the hands of artists who shared most of the values and tastes of the educated elite. In the former Soviet Union and other ex-communist countries, film production was carefully regulated by the government, and the movies produced in those countries reflected most of the values of the political elite. In America, the film industry developed within a capitalistic system of production. The Hollywood studio system was an attempt on the part of a handful of large corporations, MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, and so forth, to monopolize the production of fiction films, and hence maximize their profits. For about 3 decades, roughly from 1925 to 1955, the major studios succeeded, producing about 90% of the fiction films in America, largely because the companies were vertically integrated. That is, they controlled all 3 phases of the industry: 1. Production, the Hollywood studios; 2. Distribution, financial headquarters in New York; and 3. Exhibition, the large chains of big city first-run theaters owned by the company. During the era of studio dominance, virtually every filmmaker had to come to grips with this economic reality. The studio system was the only ballgame in town, and the majors were in business to make profits, the bigger the better. In short, the profit motive has been the main driving force in the evolution of the American film industry, and movies tend to reaffirm the ideological values of their sponsors. However, even economic historians would concede that other motives have also figured in the production of American movies: the desire for prestige, artistic integrity, and so on. Likewise, movies made in communist countries were occasionally critical of the social system that produced them. History, of any kind, is filled with contradictions. Social histories are mainly concerned with the audience. They emphasize film as a collective experience, as a reflection of mass sentiments during any given era. These sentiments can be overtly articulated or subliminally insinuated by appealing to our subconscious desires. Social historians often turn to statistics and sociological data for supporting evidence. Books like Robert Sklar's Movie Made America and Gareth Jones' film, The Democratic Art, are filled with revealing statistics about audience likes and dislikes. Social historians have also devoted a great deal of attention to the American star system, arguing that popular stars are usually a reflection of audience values and anxieties. Unfortunately, these concerns do not lend themselves to quantitative analysis, and social historians are sometimes criticized for their intuitive leaps in logic. Historians of this sort are also interested in social stereotypes, how a movie portrays blacks, women, authority figures, and so on. In film history, theory and practice, Robert C. Allen and Douglas A. Murray set forth the principal advantages and shortcomings of the various types of film history, arguing that a more integrated approach would minimize the dangers of distortion. As in other areas of film theory, film history is increasingly being viewed as a monolithic ecological system that must be studied from various perspectives to be comprehensively understood. Different film commentators ask different types of questions. Those interested in the essential nature of the medium would probably focus on such traditional concerns as the realism-formalism dichotomy. The auteur theory is helpful if you want to ask questions about how a particular movie typifies the filmmaker's thematic and stylistic traits. Obviously, this approach is not a very fruitful technique for exploring movies like Mildred Pierce or Independence Day, pictures that were constructed by committee for the purpose of maximizing profits. Eclectic critics ask whatever questions they think will help people understand and appreciate the movie better. Why is this film good, or bad, or mediocre? How could it be better? What brings it down? And so on. Structuralists ask questions about a movie's underlying infrastructure. What thematic motifs are explored in the film's narrative? What are its mythic elements? What kind of codes, both thematic and stylistic, does the movie favor? How does its genre influence the particulars of this specific movie? Does it invent, reinforce, subvert, or ridicule the genre's conventions? Depending on their orientation, historians also ask different types of questions. The arty ones are concerned with a movie's aesthetic worth and why attention should be paid. The techies are more likely to ask questions about the film's special effects, any outstanding technical achievements, such as the huge, near-scale proportions of the doomed ship in James Cameron's Titanic. Industry historians tend to ask questions concerning a movie's production expenditures and practices, how it was promoted, and what kind of tie-in products it generated. Social historians mostly ask questions about the audience. Why did the public love one movie and hate another? How does a film appeal to the public's subconscious fears and yearnings? What does a given movie say about its era? About its icons? In short, there are literally thousands of questions that could be asked concerning a movie's implications. What you yourself are looking for will determine most of your questions and how to focus them. Next chapter, Chapter Synthesis 12. Thanks for watching. Presented by thebullyexposed.com.